Everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Brandon Juarez, Associate Professor here in the College of Education at Grand Canyon University. I come to you today with over 17 years of education experience, ranging from classroom teacher to department head, chair, to athletic director and assistant school leader. And now I serve full-time as Associate Professor here in the College of Education at GCU. So I'm excited to walk you through topic 2 here in workshop series 4, titled Supporting Students to Build Academic and Life Skills. And our focus of our time today is strategies to support academic skill development. The goal, of course, and as we get started here, is for you to take opportunities to provide application to the ways that we support the academic skill development of the students on your campus. So albeit if you are a school leader, a classroom teacher, a paraprofessional watching this on-demand training, I encourage you to keep note of the elements that we talk about, of course, but to make the connection as the primary focus to how these details apply specific to the students on your campus or in your grade level or in your classroom. So before we dive in, the main objective, the only objective of our time today is to develop, is to get an understanding and to make sense of the development of study skills, student ownership of their learning, student use of feedback and efficacy, and of voice. And hopefully by you making sense of this first objective and the first element that we're taking away from our time today is to really understand the idea that we're moving our students to become lifelong learners, right? The expectation is, of course, they are learning while they're at school, not only life skills and the academic element of while they're in the classroom and the academic standards and so forth, but really the ownership of that learning process is transitioning from the teacher and the school environment to the student owning that expectation, so that when they're finished with their K-12 experience, they've matriculated through their school experience, now that process of learning, as well as the skills associated with how they learn and their efficacy, their confidence, and their voice in that feedback loop and in their learning process becomes their own. So really at the heart of what we're trying to do here is to help you make sense of going from theory to more application. How do we drive the element that we're trying to teach our students about the need to have study skills, the need to take ownership of their learning? And I really want to make sure we pause and put emphasis on this concept that it's not acceptable just for us to say, here are some things that we're trying, but more appropriate for us to say, here are things that we're trying in the name of moving our students to becoming owners of their learning and the learning process. And at the end of the day, that's the scope and certainly the intent of what we're trying to do. So when we think of study skills, we look at two main camps here. The first is through the camp of inside stakeholders, leaders, teachers, paraprofessionals, the folks watching this on-demand training, of course. The other camp, or the other tenet to this whole discussion, is the students and the development of those study skills and ownership of their learning and so forth. And we'll make sense of that in just a little bit. But first, we really want to take an internal lens to what's currently happening on the school campus, within the school environment. And that includes things like your philosophy. Yes, the person watching this recording, what's your philosophy of education? What's the responsibility of learning? And who does that fall on in terms of whose shoulders and carries the weight of that responsibility? And then ultimately, what's the culture of the school in terms of supporting the necessary study skills for these students to ultimately become adults and to take ownership of that learning experience? But first, let's take a peek at the inside stakeholders, the leaders, the teachers, and the paraprofessionals. So what I want you to do on the provided worksheet is I want you to first write some notes in reference to what is your philosophy of education. And the idea is that we first need to reflect on what is important to us as inside stakeholders, perhaps as a classroom teacher with those third graders or freshmen, whomever is in front of you as students. What is your philosophy of teaching those students? And not specific to the subject you're teaching, but more importantly, to the tenets of how students learn and your role as a facilitator, a guide on the side, and in many cases, the content expert, of course. First, we want to first navigate through the thought idea that as students matriculate through their elementary grades into middle school or junior high and secondary, into those upper elementary, and then into high school and so forth, we should start seeing a shift of the responsibility of that learning process. And we see this naturally in many cases where you get to those elementary grades where students are being taught how to make an agenda or make a planner or write down the to-do list items for the day when they're in school and so forth. And maybe sometimes we have parents, caregivers, guardians sign off on that agenda, so forth, so they can see it, and there's a level of communication and accountability there. But at the end of the day, when we first start with our students at the elementary grade level, we're starting the process of the students taking ownership and responsibility of their learning. But in most parts, when our students are 5 years old, 6 years old, and so forth, that responsibility is largely placed on the teachers for students' learning. We, as educators, are expected to provide all of the resources and really, at an elementary level, handhold those students for the sake of them learning the content and not having the weight of the responsibility of the learning. It's on us as teachers, as educators. Now, if you agree with me or disagree with that statement, that response, your response, largely stems from your philosophy of education. And that's really what we're trying to tease out here. If you agree with me with the mindset, then as we see those students matriculate through their elementary and then middle school and high school grade levels, that responsibility of learning starts to shift more onto the student, right? We see that we provide deadlines and allow students to create timetables for how they're going to get those responsibilities accomplished and those tasks complete on time. We hold students accountable with due dates and have late deductions and penalties for missing those. Well, those elements are all in the name of teaching students the responsibility to take their learning serious, and to also to teach them that they're responsible for their learning as they continue to grow up and get closer to adulthood. So as I press on this concept, I want you to think, of course, what is your philosophy? Because as we start thinking through study skills and all the ways that we support students and encourage students of these strategies, it really comes back to this idea of what do you think the role of the student is in this process? And of course, then what's the role of the teacher in this process as well? And then, of course, how does all of that play into the culture that we've created in our school environment? For instance, are there policies in place? Do we have clear expectations or norms that have been established in terms of projects that students work on and how they collaborate with their peers and how they get feedback from the teacher and at what level of feedback? What are they allowed to do with that feedback, as we'll make sense of a little bit later? But much of those elements really come from us, from the inside stakeholders, in terms of how we prepare students for the sake of becoming lifelong learners. And in this case, learning the study skills and then being held accountable to those study skills. So first is pause here if you need and jot down a few notes of what is your philosophy of this shift of the responsibility of learning from students that are at the elementary, very young, maybe even pre-K, but K level, as they grow and mature and matriculate through the K-12 experience. What's that responsibility of learning look like? Now, when we turn the corner to talking about the students when it comes to study skills, this is a fabulous text from these authors titled Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. So now we're turning our attention to what are strategies for the sake of studying, for the sake of learning the content in more of a rich, robust, deeper level when it comes to the student side of things. Well, we see these 7 strategies that are articulated in this text, and we see the need to provide opportunities for students to pre-test themselves. Maybe we give some prompts before we deliver new content to try to navigate through gaps or some prior knowledge. Students start thinking about what they're going to learn. That metacognition process will make sense of a little bit later, but that's a part of this process. Spaced practice, self-quizzing, students getting a chance to reflect on what they have learned during the learning process and to formulate some ideas of what are elements that are still missing or gaps in their learning. We'll talk a little bit later about assessment as learning, assessment for learning, and assessment of learning, what that process looks like, as well as interleaving practice and paraphrasing and reflecting. We see these in the classroom. We see these as prompts from teachers, but this is a fabulous text, and I don't want to steal any of their thunder of what these authors do to go into providing strategies and details regarding these 7 components of helping students learn the strategies on how to study and ultimately how to create a deeper level of their learning through those study habits. Now, something that I want to draw your attention to here that hopefully you find either you're already implementing and providing practice to, or that you find quite easy to implement and get started right away with. The first, I want to make sure that you note, and so on your handbook or your handout here, I'd like you to jot down the phrase that students of all grade levels don't know what they don't know. Right? With that concept, we need to keep in mind that students need strategies, right? They don't need the answers always. In this case, they need the tools so they can solve their own problems and they can create those opportunities on their own, but they need the strategies. Okay, so the first strategy is, in many cases, holding students to the schedule that we create for them. And that comes through time management. So we see this at the elementary grades when students are learning how to write essays, for example, in English language arts. Perhaps teachers provide, the topic and then steer students through, by this date, you should have your topic sentences for your paragraphs or the bubble map created. And we are guiding students through the framework on how to manage their time. And then, of course, as they get older in their course studies throughout their K-12 experience, then that responsibility starts to shift more to we provide due dates and expectations, and then we let them establish their time management. And yes, this is, we'll get to the last box here. The next component of time management is accountability and holding them accountable to that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But after time management, another strategy that students could really leverage and we can encourage is students to create study groups. And yes, of course, we probably think of these study groups as outside of school hours and students practicing with one another at home or at the park or maybe in the school library or maybe even through the use of technology and so forth. But really, it starts with us creating an opportunity for students to practice studying and reinforcing the content that we're teaching through the way that we create cooperative learning strategies in class, students working in groups and working on projects together. And it can be even quite trivial over just one element of your lesson with students working in a small group or quizzing one another. There's a bunch of strategies where students can learn from each other through those group practices. But it also can be more traditional where students are given a project and they have to find time outside of class to work together and to leverage one another as a resource. Students also need opportunities to practice the idea of guides or prompts. So, again, going back to your school's culture or philosophy, what level of support do we already provide students through the use of study guides or prompts that they're going to see on an assessment and so forth? That in its own right is a way that students can really think through the assessments and think through what they're going to be accountable to learn through us kind of guiding them through that process and putting on some prompts for them to make sense of, okay, that's what I need to make sense of, or that's, what he or she's trying to get across. So in some cases, maybe providing resources for students, maybe early on in the elementary grades, and we start to wean off of that process as they get or later on into their secondary education experience. But at some levels, students need some strategies on how to study in terms of what's most important. And we can do that through guides and prompts. Next, the study environment. Again, students need strategies. So when we think of the study environment, perhaps you give students some expectations or some things to think about when they're at home when it comes to studying on their own. And that starts predominantly with the study environment. So we should be encouraging students to find an area in their home or outside of school when they do study that is free of distractions. I can't help but think there's a bunch of articles now with the ubiquitous level of technology in students' pockets, at the secondary level for sure, but as it gets younger and younger, where students aren't quick to find their cell phone, and when things get hard, they just kind of turn away and turn their attention to social media and trying to kind of mentally check out. But the environment needs to be free from distractions, including maybe away from the cell phone, and away from different elements where they're going to be constantly pulled away from that process of learning. What do you think about maybe using music in some cases, or not having music, but a controlled environment where students can study? One element I encourage you to jot down on your handout is the idea that the study environment when students are studying, we know in the literature now, researchers have discovered and continue to suggest that learning happens much deeper when we do smaller stints of studying, rather than trying to cram at the last minute or trying to do hours upon hours of studying. We find more consistent but smaller blocks of studying is what's more fruitful for students to actually obtain the content that they're trying to learn. So that means, 20 minutes, then get up and move around and get a brain break. Maybe check that phone or allow yourself to exit the thinking and processing experience, and then return maybe the next day or later that day for another 20 minutes of a deep dive into that learning process. But that often stems from having a place and an environment where they can dive deep for 20 minutes without being distracted. And then next, in terms of motivation for students, and I want you to pause here again, go to your handout, and a key takeaway from our time today is the idea that, we need to be careful not to use grades as the predominant way to motivate students for the sake of their learning. The learning itself should be the motivation. And that's, of course, what we'll see on the next screen in just a moment about the need for us as educators to know our content really well, to make that a rich learning environment where even in some cases, maybe the content that we don't really enjoy ourselves, or perhaps content that we find quite difficult to teach, we have to make that come to life for our students. And so one way that we do that is by creating application for opportunities for students to learn the content, rather than just say, you need to know this because you need a grade. Yeah, grades are important to be sure, but in some cases, and frankly, in many cases, students won't use a grade as the predominant way that's going to motivate them to take the time to study on their own. Okay. And then lastly, accountability. Like I said, again, this aligns back to our school culture and the vision and mission of our school, but also the policies of our school in terms of how we hold students accountable to those grades, to the opportunity to learn from their feedback, as well as to due dates and what do they do with reinforcing that time management piece. So if you're unfamiliar with, or the school hasn't created a policy or an expectation on how we're going to hold students accountable to their study skills and to mastery of the content, then perhaps this is the first step for us as inside stakeholders. Now, this quote comes from a website that I'm going to encourage you to take a peek at. The link there is at the bottom, as well as in the references at the end of this presentation. But the authors of this site share this quote: "Learning is not a passive process. Students are not sponges for facts." And I want to pause here just to give you this other tidbit of information, is that now in the year you're watching this video, with technology and with the internet readily available in many cases in the palm of students' hands, and with all of the videos and resources and all the different ways that student can learn the content, it's important to keep in mind that teachers should refrain from the idea that they're the sage on stage. Maybe 30 years ago, the teacher was the predominant and perhaps the only content expert in the whole school for that content, for those academic standards. But keep in mind, 30 years ago, we didn't have content standards. But the idea is the element of the teacher has shifted significantly over the past several decades. Honestly, not that long ago, when the teacher knew the content and they were the purveyors of the content, and they were the only ones as content experts. Well, now students can learn much of the content that we as teachers teach through a 5-minute YouTube video or through another learning platform freely available and free online. So what's our role as teachers? And as the authors of this quote share, students are not sponges for facts. They can get those facts in many cases without you or without us as educators. So then what is our role, right? And again, back to our philosophy about how to prepare and help students take ownership of their learning. So let's read on. Teachers cannot assume they will have each pupil's full attention simply by standing in front of the room and talking. Injecting exciting visuals and interactive elements within a lesson is a step in the right direction, but to be an effective teacher, you need to help your kids take ownership of their learning. And we do that by teaching our students to apply their learning, and we'll make sense of that as we move to this next slide. So when we think of student ownership of their learning, the many researchers, when you look into the literature about this topic of ownership of learning, regardless of the grade level, the research has continued to come back, and the literature seems saturated with the idea that we need to provide meaningful choices to our students. So that starts with us having a clear and measurable learning objectives. We as educators have a clear understanding of the content we're teaching and a mastery of the content we're teaching. And so what we need to keep in mind is that it's not just rote memory that we're trying to teach our students, but instead we're teaching our students how to apply that learning in a real world environment as much as we can, of course. So think of through, inquiry-based learning or project-based learning and all these deeper levels of learning where students can take ownership of that process and really be constructive in their learning environment. That's what it means for students to take ownership, is that I just need to remember facts, but they need to learn the tools that they then can apply to multiple facets. And this is why we want to provide choices within that learning experience. Next, we want to provide and leverage feedback. We'll make sense of feedback in just a little bit. And then, of course, finally, connections to real world experiences. So as much as you can put students in role plays or scenarios where they have to take that content and then apply it in a working environment or in a real world environment would be the deepest and the richest level of learning. So we see this in math, for instance, where we provide problems in written text form, where it's a word problem, where you're putting your student in a scenario where they have to apply that learning or those formulas and so forth. We see this in English language arts, where students have to write about their personal experiences or do a biography report or some element that connects to real world experiences, including all the informational text standards that we have across the ELA standards. So as much as we can know the content for us as educators and then provide choices for our students to master that content through real world experiences is what's going to provide students the richest and deepest level to take ownership of their learning. And next element I want to pause here, this first upper left block here, is that learning is hard and takes persistence. So the note I want you to jot down in your handout is the idea that in many cases, all of us, including me at one point or another, were either told out loud or given the impression that learning is fun. And I want to pause here, and yes, you heard me correctly. Learning is not fun. And you may think to yourself, Dr. Juarez, what are you talking about? Learning isn't fun. How are we supposed to create an environment for our students if we're not sharing the idea that learning is fun? Well, this is part of this misconception that in many cases students latch onto, like perhaps we did, and then we get sadly let down when we find that learning is hard. And then we start questioning, am I dumb? Am I not learning it like I should? What am I missing? And we really start to doubt ourselves. And that's not the confidence that, of course, that we're trying to implement and to teach our students. So the first element I encourage you to keep in mind is to really get to the nuts and bolts here and to unpack this concept of learning. Learning, in fact, is quite rigorous. And we know general psychology tells us that when things get hard, we have a natural tendency to push away from doing hard things. This is a challenge. Maybe tomorrow, right? Or maybe I'll do a little bit now, but we resist hard things. And it's important that when we are learning, even us as adults, but specifically for our fifth graders or our 5-year-olds or our 15-year-olds, regardless of the student age, we need to keep in mind that the concepts that we're an expert in are brand new to our students, And when we present new content to our students, we have to keep in mind that in many cases, the learning that we're expecting our students to want to dive into because it's so much fun and so forth, they're going to resist that because it's hard. They're going to see that mountain as being too high to climb, right? So we need to think of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. When students see that mountain to climb as being 8 zones above their learning, they're going to resist, right? Because it's too much, too soon, and they don't have the strategies, the tools to proceed. But what we need to keep in mind is that the outcome of learning is what's fun. And so what we want to attempt to get our students to do is constantly remind them and show them, when you learn this, here's what you can do with it. And the learning itself is rigorous, and to support students through that process, and to not promote their doubt, right? But to take hold of that and say, yeah, this is hard, and it should be hard because you're learning something new. But hang in there, because once you learn it and you have a new tool in your toolbox, now that learning becomes fun because you can apply that rigorous experience that you took so long to learn and to process and to engage in and persisted through. Now you get to apply it, and that's the learning part, right? So an example of that is for students in the secondary level, where they're learning a foreign language, right? Learning a foreign language is incredibly rigorous, especially if you have no prior knowledge. And so when you're learning those vocabulary and syntax and all the different elements of the lexicon, vernacular, that process is tedious and quite difficult for many students. This is probably why many of us, including me, took 2 years of a foreign language in high school and don't remember much of it, right? Because we didn't get past that barrier of starting to be able to apply that learning and then take that ownership of the learning process once the that school year is ended or through that learning experience is concluded. But can you imagine at the end of your learning experience, when you're done with a foreign language at the end of a school year, that you get to go to a community or to a country where you get to apply that foreign language? Think about, now we start seeing that learning is fun because I get to apply and I get to see the fruits of my labor, right? So the learning itself is hard. Please make sense of that. But the outcome of learning is what's fun. And we need to help our students see that process, that learning and taking ownership. They're not doing it wrong when it's hard. In fact, they're doing it right. And to persist through that and to motivate our students through that is a great first step to help them understand that learning takes time and effort, but the fruits of their labor are always worthwhile. Next, in the top right corner, we as educators must know our content we teach, and we need to know it well. So this means professional development sessions specific to the content you teach. This means learning through collaborative circles and PLCs regarding the content standards that you're expected to teach, finding different ways to connect that learning to what's meaningful or impactful for your students. In terms of the age and grade that your students are, what do they like, and how can you tie in some of their interests to what it is you're teaching? For instance, sports teams or hobbies or music, things that your students are into. Can you tie that to the content you're teaching? So that'll be a deeper level of transfer of learning when students can make sense of their learning and apply it across content areas, and they can find ways to connect to it. And then finally, one important element for us as educators is to anticipate the areas of need. And what I mean by that is for us to know, because we know our content so well, we know where students are going to struggle, right? We know right away, to give a young elementary grade example, that students are going to struggle with multiplication facts. And because they're going to struggle with multiplication facts, they're going to struggle with long division, right? Which comes quickly thereafter. So if we know that they're going to struggle in those areas, it's important for us to really sink our teeth into and make sense of how can we provide ways in which students can make sense of that learning in multiple ways. That means, again, making that content relevant to things that students are interested in, or providing videos and extra resources or extra time for students to practice their learning. We, of course, need to know our content so well that we know and can anticipate where there's going to be high areas of need, and then we can do something about it and schedule our time and our learning environments accordingly, so students can really work through that practice and work through their learning experiences accordingly. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention and turn the corner to student use of feedback. And we're going to look at these two main components here: assessment as, for, and of learning, and then the feedback we provide to students and what they're expected to do with that feedback in terms of being constructive, authentic, and specific. So first, in just a moment, I'm going to have you pause this video, and I want you to scan this QR code here. It's going to take you to an Edutopia article that this author wrote not too long ago, but that's teaching students to assess their learning. So when we think of using feedback for the sake of our students' learning, in your handout here, you see blanks for these three words: assessment as, assessment for, and assessment of learning. So I want to draw your attention here to when we think of assessment of learning, this is what's most common to us, right? Is that we need to, as educators, assess our students' learning. And we see that through mostly summative assessments like a chapter test or a unit exam or an essay students turn in or a ticket out the door in some way or some fashion. But assessment of learning is something you're most common, you make sense of every day, and is very common for us. However, assessment as learning is, and this is what you're going to jot down, is assessment as learning is where we get the opportunity to expose gaps for our students because they're using that assessment, that feedback, that data that they're getting as evidence of what are they learning. And when you start giving students a chance to apply their learning, where it's no longer just, memorize this and memorize that, where now students get a chance to start applying what they're learning, we really give them an opportunity to expose gaps in their learning. And that's a good thing. We need to give students a chance to make sense of, I thought I knew it, but now when I get a chance to actually use this content, I'm finding that I don't quite get it just yet because I got to figure out how to apply it. Right. And so assessment as learning gives us a great opportunity for our students to expose them to what they don't know just yet. And so we see this as a formative assessment where this is a check for understanding. And then we need to give our students a chance to then take those gaps and then make sense of how they're going to fill those gaps. And then finally, assessment for learning. This helps the teacher with instruction, with future instruction. So assessment for learning means that we as educators are going to take that data, take that evidence, and then apply it to the lesson plans we create and the instructional environments that we create, and think of differentiation, the ways that we provide universal design for learning with different ways to represent the content or multiple means to engage students in the content. And then finally, multiple ways for students to express what they're learning. But that all happens through assessment for learning. So we're going to use that assessment for the sake of future learning. Now, in this first article, you're going to make sense of this assessment as learning, exposing gaps to our students. And we really start making sense of this metacognition component where we help students start thinking about how do they think, how do they learn in terms of the environment that they create outside of school and the environment we create in school and so forth. But teachers can help students evaluate their knowledge and learning processes by guiding them to assess their use of metacognitive skills. And this is what this article is going to help you make sense of. So we'll see you back in just a moment. Go ahead and pause this video and go ahead and read this article. We'll see you in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. So after reading that article, we're going to jump into another article in just a moment. But before we do, I want to read you this quote. Students' academic performance is linked to their ability to engage in thinking strategies, especially the metacognitive processes that make self-regulated learning possible. As students learn more about their thinking, they also increase their ability to manage their own thoughts. Students who develop their metacognitive skills may begin to think about learning differently. Here's the fun part. Instead of viewing learning as teacher dependent, which we're moving, and goes back to the first element of this video and this recording, is that we need to think about that shift from us being responsible for their learning to students being responsible for the learning. And we need to pivot to allow students to take ownership of it. I pick up in the middle of the sentence. They may start to understand what learning that learning is something they have the tools to do on their own. Being able to see the connection between their choices and the outcomes they experience in school helps students to develop agency, that efficacy, and having a voice over their own learning and become leaders in their own learning process. So again, teaching our students strategies so they can take ownership of it rather than us, badgering them that you need to learn this and this is for a grade. And those strategies don't work. Instead, let's give our students opportunities to reflect on their learning and then hold them accountable to it by using the natural consequences of due dates and grades and all that sort of stuff. But then understanding we need to provide strategies for students to do something with what they're learning and then how to apply their learning. So with that, feedback that empowers students. So what kind of feedback do you provide to your students and how timely is it? And what are they expected to do with the feedback that you provide your students? So I want you to pause here in just a moment and use the handout after you scan this QR code to make sense of what this author has to share with some of the strategies to make feedback authentic, specific, as well as constructive for your students. So what I encourage you to think about is how quickly can students get their feedback? What are they expected to do with their feedback? And how can it be in a way where students don't see feedback as being punitive, but in a way in which that students see the feedback we provide them as being supportive and helpful in their endeavor to take on that learning and to learn new concepts. So go ahead and pause here for this last moment and read this article. I'll be back with you to close things up. Okay, well, welcome back. I'll move this over here so you can get to this QR code. So the third QR code is specific to this training. But as we wrap things up here, folks, when we think of this idea of study skills and teaching students how to take ownership of their learning and all the ways that we provide feedback to our students, I hope and sincerely want you to make sense of the need for you to become a content expert. And, this is a practicing profession, this thing we call education, meaning that you are continuing to know more about your students, know more about their interests and prior knowledge and backgrounds and cultures, and then know your content and where you're going to bridge that gap for your students. And that's the role of us as educators, right? Is to make that learning come to life. Academic standards change periodically, but our students change every 180 school days, right? So we need to stay current on not only best practice of the content, but how to bridge that learning for our students, and then to provide opportunities for our students to engage in those experiences, to take ownership of that process. So I leave you with this. In this second article, you're to make sense of the connections to learning, to the target, and to the standards that we're expected to teach our students. And so I encourage you to continue to write lesson plans, continue to write measurable objectives, continue to use evidence that you create and collect from your students to help your students see their learning and to make connections with your students at a personal level through rapport building, so that we end on this idea that because learning is hard and because learning takes persistence and courage to try something new and perhaps get exposed in terms of what you don't know, or maybe beliefs that aren't accurate to what they're learning, that takes a lot of courage for students. So I encourage you to make those connections with your students and to ultimately help them see that the learning is possible and that the learning outcomes are fun and worth their investment. So thanks for watching this, and please scan that QR code, and I look forward to getting your feedback. Take care.